The studio lot was alive with the sound of hustle and bustle, crew members moving quickly between trailers, lights flickering as they were adjusted, and the distant rumble of large trucks delivering props. It was another busy day on set for a high-budget action film, one that promised to deliver heart-stopping thrills and a star-studded cast. But what no one could anticipate was that this day, this moment, would become more than just another day of filming. It would become the day that shook Hollywood to its core. At the center of it all, Sandra Bullock stood quietly near her mark, dressed in the worn, battle-ready attire of her character. She was a true professional, always calm, always prepared. But today, there was something different in the air. The usual hum of busy people around her seemed drowned out by an unspoken tension, as if the whole set knew something was about to happen. The director, Victor Collins, was pacing nearby, his hands running through his hair, his eyes darting from the monitors to the actors. His nerves were visibly frayed, and Sandra could tell that something had shifted in the atmosphere. It was as though the man had lost all sense of control. Victor wasn't known for being the most gracious director. He had a reputation for his high standards, but he was also infamous for pushing people too far, especially his actors. But today, he was something else. His frustration was palpable, and Sandra, ever the seasoned professional, took a deep breath. She had worked with all kinds of directors, good, bad, and everything in between, but something about the way Victor was acting sent a chill down her spine. It didn't take long for her to figure out why. As the scene began, Sandra delivered her lines with poise and confidence. But Victor, looking increasingly impatient, suddenly shouted from the director's chair, "No, no, no! What are you doing? This is awful. You call that acting? Is this all you've got?" His voice cracked with a mixture of anger and frustration, and the entire set froze. A cold silence fell over the crew as Sandra stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest. She was no stranger to criticism, but the venom in his voice, the utter contempt in his tone, it was different. This wasn't about the craft. It was personal. Sandra's face turned a shade of red, her pride stung. She could feel the eyes of everyone on set now, as though they were waiting for her to break. But she held her ground. She took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the line again, despite the burning humiliation that was slowly creeping into her chest. She was strong, but no one, no matter how much they'd been through, could ever fully prepare for being publicly humiliated by someone who had the power to crush their career. It was then that a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Victor, that's enough," came a calm but powerful voice from behind the cameras. Tom Cruise, the film's co-star and one of the most respected actors in the industry, stepped forward, his expression stern, his eyes blazing with fury. Sandra glanced up, surprised to see him standing there. Tom wasn't known to get involved in on-set politics, let alone step into confrontations, but there was something different about the way he was looking at Victor. The usual easygoing, charming persona Tom was known for was gone. In its place was a sharp, no-nonsense intensity that sent a wave of shock through everyone on set. Victor, clearly taken aback by Tom's sudden intervention, opened his mouth to protest, but Tom didn't give him the chance. "You think it's okay to treat her like that? To humiliate her in front of everyone? I don't care if you're the director. That's not how we work around here." Sandra couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief at Tom's words. He was known for his professionalism, but she had never seen him this fierce before. She could see the fire in his eyes. It was the same fire that had earned him the respect of everyone in the industry. Tom Cruise was not just a movie star. He was a protector of those he worked with, and today, he would not let anyone, not even a director, cross the line. The tension on set thickened. Everyone watched, unsure of what would happen next. Would the director fight back? Would the crew side with him or with Tom? But one thing was certain, Tom Cruise had just stepped into the fray, and there was no turning back now. This sets the stage for a story full of emotional conflict, a display of courage and honor, and a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right. Even in the ruthless world of Hollywood, the set fell into a heavy silence after Tom's bold declaration. The camera crew, who had been used to seeing Tom Cruise in his role as the charming, fearless leading man, now saw a side of him they weren't familiar with. For all the glitz and glamour, Hollywood wasn't just about the roles they played on screen. It was about power, who had it, and who didn't. And right now, Victor Collins, the director, was used to having it all. Victor had built his reputation on controlling every frame, every line, and every actor's performance. He was notorious for his ruthless critiques, his unflinching demand for perfection. But his ego, as inflated as it was, had begun to overtake the delicate art of filmmaking. His obsession with control led him to treat his actors like puppets, especially the ones he thought he could manipulate. Sandra Bullock had been in the business long enough to know that power dynamics on set were everything. She had been a victim of a director's outbursts before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the words. It was about the complete disregard for her years of experience, her dedication to the craft, and, most of all, her humanity. Sandra was no rookie. She had fought tooth and nail for every role, every ounce of respect she had earned. But being publicly torn apart like that, by someone with no regard for her worth, was something that hit deep. She stood there, frozen, trying to hold her composure as the humiliation simmered inside her. It was a moment she had hoped would never come again. The truth was, Sandra didn't need the validation of directors like Victor. She had made it on her own terms. But no matter how much success one achieves, no one was immune to the sting of being humiliated in front of their peers. Victor, however, couldn't see the damage he was doing. He was too focused on his vision, his grand idea of what the film should be. He was the king of the set, and everyone else was a mere pawn to serve his master plan. Tom Cruise, though, wasn't about to let Victor get away with it. The studio lot was alive with the sound of hustle and bustle, crew members moving quickly between trailers, lights flickering as they were adjusted, and the distant rumble of large trucks delivering props. It was another busy day on set for a high-budget action film, one that promised to deliver heart-stopping thrills and a star-studded cast. But what no one could anticipate was that this day, this moment, would become more than just another day of filming. It would become the day that shook Hollywood to its core. At the center of it all, Sandra Bullock stood quietly near her mark, dressed in the worn, battle-ready attire of her character. She was a true professional, always calm, always prepared. But today, there was something different in the air. The usual hum of busy people around her seemed drowned out by an unspoken tension, as if the whole set knew something was about to happen. The director, Victor Collins, was pacing nearby, his hands running through his hair, his eyes darting from the monitors to the actors. His nerves were visibly frayed, and Sandra could tell that something had shifted in the atmosphere. It was as though the man had lost all sense of control. Victor wasn't known for being the most gracious director. He had a reputation for his high standards, but he was also infamous for pushing people too far, especially his actors. But today, he was something else. His frustration was palpable, and Sandra, ever the seasoned professional, took a deep breath. She had worked with all kinds of directors, good, bad, and everything in between, but something about the way Victor was acting sent a chill down her spine. It didn't take long for her to figure out why. As the scene began, Sandra delivered her lines with poise and confidence. But Victor, looking increasingly impatient, suddenly shouted from the director's chair, "No, no, no! What are you doing? This is awful. You call that acting? Is this all you've got?" His voice cracked with a mixture of anger and frustration, and the entire set froze. A cold silence fell over the crew as Sandra stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest. She was no stranger to criticism, but the venom in his voice, the utter contempt in his tone, it was different. This wasn't about the craft. It was personal. Sandra's face turned a shade of red, her pride stung. She could feel the eyes of everyone on set now, as though they were waiting for her to break. But she held her ground. She took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the line again, despite the burning humiliation that was slowly creeping into her chest. She was strong, but no one, no matter how much they'd been through, could ever fully prepare for being publicly humiliated by someone who had the power to crush their career. It was then that a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Victor, that's enough," came a calm but powerful voice from behind the cameras. Tom Cruise, the film's co-star and one of the most respected actors in the industry, stepped forward, his expression stern, his eyes blazing with fury. Sandra glanced up, surprised to see him standing there. Tom wasn't known to get involved in on-set politics, let alone step into confrontations, but there was something different about the way he was looking at Victor. The usual easygoing, charming persona Tom was known for was gone. In its place was a sharp, no-nonsense intensity that sent a wave of shock through everyone on set. Victor, clearly taken aback by Tom's sudden intervention, opened his mouth to protest, but Tom didn't give him the chance. "You think it's okay to treat her like that? To humiliate her in front of everyone? I don't care if you're the director. That's not how we work around here." Sandra couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief at Tom's words. He was known for his professionalism, but she had never seen him this fierce before. She could see the fire in his eyes. It was the same fire that had earned him the respect of everyone in the industry. Tom Cruise was not just a movie star. He was a protector of those he worked with, and today, he would not let anyone, not even a director, cross the line. The tension on set thickened. Everyone watched, unsure of what would happen next. Would the director fight back? Would the crew side with him or with Tom? But one thing was certain, Tom Cruise had just stepped into the fray, and there was no turning back now. This sets the stage for a story full of emotional conflict, a display of courage and honor, and a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right. Even in the ruthless world of Hollywood, the set fell into a heavy silence after Tom's bold declaration. The camera crew, who had been used to seeing Tom Cruise in his role as the charming, fearless leading man, now saw a side of him they weren't familiar with. For all the glitz and glamour, Hollywood wasn't just about the roles they played on screen. It was about power, who had it, and who didn't. And right now, Victor Collins, the director, was used to having it all. Victor had built his reputation on controlling every frame, every line, and every actor's performance. He was notorious for his ruthless critiques, his unflinching demand for perfection. But his ego, as inflated as it was, had begun to overtake the delicate art of filmmaking. His obsession with control led him to treat his actors like puppets, especially the ones he thought he could manipulate. Sandra Bullock had been in the business long enough to know that power dynamics on set were everything. She had been a victim of a director's outbursts before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the words. It was about the complete disregard for her years of experience, her dedication to the craft, and, most of all, her humanity. Sandra was no rookie. She had fought tooth and nail for every role, every ounce of respect she had earned. But being publicly torn apart like that, by someone with no regard for her worth, was something that hit deep. She stood there, frozen, trying to hold her composure as the humiliation simmered inside her. It was a moment she had hoped would never come again. The truth was, Sandra didn't need the validation of directors like Victor. She had made it on her own terms. But no matter how much success one achieves, no one was immune to the sting of being humiliated in front of their peers. Victor, however, couldn't see the damage he was doing. He was too focused on his vision, his grand idea of what the film should be. He was the king of the set, and everyone else was a mere pawn to serve his master plan. Tom Cruise, though, wasn't about to let Victor get away with it. The silence that followed Tom's intervention seemed endless, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Sandra stood frozen, unsure of what would come next. She had spent years in Hollywood, years of navigating egos, intense scrutiny, and directors who believed their vision was everything. But never had she felt the weight of a situation like this one. Tom had stepped in, yes, but now what? Victor was a seasoned director with decades in the industry. He didn't take kindly to being challenged, especially not by someone as prominent as Tom Cruise. The man was a legend, revered in every corner of Hollywood, but even Tom wasn't invincible. There were rules in this business, unspoken ones, that dictated how things were supposed to unfold on set. And Tom had just shattered them all. Victor slowly straightened up in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests as if trying to steady himself. His face was flush with anger, his eyes narrowing in contempt. The crew, which had been holding their breath, now shifted uneasily, sensing that a showdown was inevitable. "You've gone too far this time, Tom," Victor finally spoke, his voice cold and deliberate. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this is my production, my project. You may be the star, but that doesn't give you the right to undermine me." He stood up slowly, his posture stiffening with authority. "I'm the one in charge here. And you can take your little lecture and walk off this set if you're so upset." For a brief moment, Sandra thought she might suffocate under the weight of the tension. Victor's words stung, not because of their content, but because of their delivery. He was threatening not just Tom but everyone who worked under him. It wasn't the first time she'd witnessed this kind of arrogance from a director, but it was the first time she saw it met with such strong defiance. Tom didn't flinch. He was calm, his expression unchanging, as if he had already considered all possible outcomes. "I'm not going anywhere," Tom said, his voice unwavering. "And if you think you can continue treating Sandra, or anyone else here, like that, you've got another thing coming." Victor's eyes twitched. This wasn't the kind of reaction he was used to. He'd bullied people in the past, sure, but Tom was different. Tom was powerful. Tom could walk off this set and the movie would lose its lead. Victor knew that, and it was a fact that gnawed at him. But pride was a dangerous thing. "You're making a mistake, Tom," Victor said, his voice now dripping with venom. "You really think you can come in here and tell me how to do my job? This isn't your place. You're not my boss." Tom stood tall, unwavering. "No, I'm not your boss. But I'm not going to let you bully someone I respect." There was a moment of dead silence as the crew held their collective breath, waiting for Victor to respond. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. Sandra could feel the tension in the air like a physical presence. She wanted to speak, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She knew that this moment was bigger than her, bigger than anyone on set. It was about something more than just a director's outburst, it was about decency, about what it meant to truly respect the people around you. Victor's hand clenched into a fist. For a split second, Sandra thought he might lash out, either verbally or physically, but he seemed to control himself. Instead, he turned away, walking toward the production table with stiff, angry steps. "I don't need this," he muttered under his breath, glaring at the monitors. "We'll take a break. Everyone, get back to your trailers. We're done for the day." The crew shuffled away, unsure whether to be relieved or worried. Sandra stayed where she was, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She wanted to leave, to walk away from the set and never return, but something in her knew that doing so would let Victor win. It wasn't just about her dignity, it was about standing up for everyone who had ever been belittled or cast aside because someone thought they had the power to treat them like garbage. Tom's gaze softened as he walked over to Sandra. His demeanor shifted, the fierce anger from moments ago melting into something more compassionate. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Sandra managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice betraying a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "But thank you. That meant more than you know." Tom nodded, his expression serious. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a quiet determination. "Victor may think he's the one in charge, but he's forgotten something important. This isn't just about making a film. It's about making sure the people you work with know they matter." He glanced toward the door, where the crew was beginning to trickle out. "And I'm not going to let him get away with treating people like that." Sandra looked at him, a surge of admiration washing over her. Tom was standing up not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been subjected to an arrogant director's tantrums. In that moment, she knew this wasn't just a battle about one man's ego. This was a fight for respect. For fairness. But as the crew dispersed and the day wound down, Sandra couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her gut. She knew that Victor would not back down easily. He was a man who had built his career on control, and Tom's intervention had shaken him to his core. Victor was likely to come up with a counterattack, something that would make this far more complicated than a simple confrontation on set. Tom, too, knew this was only the beginning. He could sense the impending storm. Victor might have been humiliated, but he wasn't the type to give up without a fight. And as much as Tom respected the people on set, he knew that Victor's influence extended beyond just one film. It could affect their careers, their reputations. But that wasn't going to stop him. Tom turned to Sandra once more, his expression resolute. "We'll get through this. No matter what it takes." And so, as the night fell over the studio lot, a sense of quiet uncertainty settled in. The battle had only just begun. The stakes were higher now, higher than just their film, their reputations, or the money riding on it. It was about the values they stood for, the people they respected, and the way they allowed others to treat them. The real conflict wasn't going to be on screen. It was going to be on the set. The days that followed the confrontation were tense. The set, once brimming with the usual energy of creativity and collaboration, now felt weighed down by a cloud of uncertainty. Sandra could barely shake the feeling of being watched, of being the subject of whispered conversations and furtive glances. It was clear that the fallout from her public humiliation, and Tom's bold intervention, was still reverberating through the crew. Victor, ever the professional when it came to appearances, tried his best to carry on as though nothing had happened. But the cracks were visible to everyone. The way he glared at Sandra when she entered the room, the way his orders grew more curt, his temper more erratic. It wasn't just the power dynamic between him and Tom that had shifted, it was the delicate balance of respect that had been lost in the fallout of the confrontation. And then there was Tom. Sandra knew that his reputation was as big as his career. If anyone could challenge Victor and walk away unscathed, it was Tom Cruise. But even Tom wasn't immune to the repercussions of challenging someone with Victor's power. Despite his confidence, Sandra saw a flicker of concern in his eyes every time he passed Victor on set. Tom knew that Victor had a way of making things difficult, and if he chose to make an enemy of the director, it could cost them both. But Tom wasn't backing down. He had made a stand, and he wasn't going to retreat into the shadows just because things had gotten uncomfortable. He was committed to making sure Sandra was treated with the respect she deserved, and if that meant going head-to-head with Victor every single day, so be it. "Tom," Sandra called out one afternoon after a particularly grueling scene, her voice tinged with exhaustion. She caught him in the hallway near the makeup trailers, where he was checking his phone, as usual, scanning the news or catching up on emails. "We need to talk." Tom looked up from his phone, giving her his full attention, a warm but concerned expression on his face. "What's going on?" Sandra hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the set, where she knew Victor was waiting to call for the next take. "It's not just about me anymore, is it? I can see the way things are changing for you too." Tom's brow furrowed, his usual self-assured smile faltering just slightly. He hadn't said it out loud, but he'd been feeling the pressure mounting in ways that were hard to ignore. The whispers on set were growing louder, and they weren't just about the film. They were about Tom's role in this growing conflict with Victor. "I'm fine," Tom said, but his voice lacked the conviction that normally came with his words. He wasn't fine. He could feel the undercurrent of animosity growing between him and Victor. It was beginning to affect everyone on set. The crew members who had once eagerly followed his lead were now walking on eggshells around both him and the director. No one wanted to be caught in the middle. Sandra, however, wasn't going to let him brush her off. She knew better. She had seen him battle through press tours, movie premieres, and personal scandals, but she also knew that Tom cared deeply about the people he worked with. He wasn't going to let Victor bully them into silence, and he wasn't going to let the situation spiral out of control. "Tom, this is more than just us," Sandra said, her voice soft but urgent. "Victor's not the only one here who's hurting. We're all affected by what's happening. It's already impacting the crew. Everyone is either afraid to speak up or too scared to even make eye contact with you." Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he considered her words. "I know. Believe me, I know." He looked over his shoulder toward the set, where the crew was beginning to assemble again. "Victor's got a lot of power, Sandra. He's not going to back down easily. And if I keep pushing him, I risk pulling everyone else down with us." Sandra crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "And what if you do nothing? What happens then?" Tom's eyes softened. She had a point. If he backed down now, it would send a message to the crew that Victor was untouchable, that people like Sandra didn't deserve protection, and that it was okay to treat others with cruelty if you were powerful enough. But there was a bigger concern, something that wasn't as obvious to most people. The studio. Word had already begun to spread about the tension between Tom and Victor, and the studio execs were beginning to take notice. They had their own interests to protect, chief among them, making sure the film stayed on schedule and within budget. Hollywood was a machine, and machines didn't care about human dignity. They cared about results. Tom had gotten wind that the studio was considering stepping in, asking him to smooth things over with Victor for the sake of the production. They didn't care about what happened behind the scenes, as long as the movie got made. The idea of making compromises for the sake of the production gnawed at Tom. He had fought too long and too hard for his own principles, for what he believed in, to let the machine grind him down now. In the midst of this, another conflict was brewing, one that Tom hadn't anticipated. There was a growing rift between some of the crew members. A handful of them were starting to quietly side with Victor, possibly out of fear or simply because they had worked with him for years and didn't want to risk their own standing in the industry. These crew members began speaking ill of Tom and Sandra behind their backs, sowing discord among the team. There were whispers in the halls, in the break rooms, and in the dark corners of the set. "Did you hear what Tom said? Who does he think he is?" they would mutter, just loud enough for others to hear. "Victor's been in this business longer than anyone. Tom should just know his place," they'd complain. For Sandra, this was another layer of the struggle. She was used to being judged, used to facing challenges in the public eye, but this was different. This wasn't a competition for a role or a headline, it was about the very integrity of their set, the culture that had been established by years of unspoken rules and expectations. Tom had made his choice, but now it seemed as though they were not only fighting Victor's arrogance but also the creeping sense of disunity among the very people they were trying to protect. As the crew gathered for another day of filming, Sandra found herself staring down the barrel of an even bigger challenge. She wasn't just fighting for her dignity anymore, she was fighting for the soul of the production itself. The line between right and wrong was becoming increasingly blurred, and soon, she would have to decide just how far she was willing to go to make sure that Victor, and anyone else who dared to cross the line, understood that bullying was not something they could get away with. Tom was with her, but this fight was bigger than just one person. The stakes were higher than ever. The day the tension finally boiled over was unlike any other on set. It started like any typical day of shooting, with the crew running through last-minute adjustments, checking angles, and making sure every detail was perfect. But the air was thick, and everyone could feel it, something was coming. The question wasn't if it would happen, it was when. Victor had been growing more erratic with each passing day, his frustration mounting as his power over the set slowly slipped away. His temper had gotten shorter, his patience thinner, and his cruel remarks toward Sandra had escalated. Today, however, it wasn't just Sandra who felt the brunt of his anger. The entire crew was starting to feel the weight of his wrath. Tom had spent days silently watching as Victor bullied Sandra and some of the other crew members. His refusal to back down had put him at odds with everyone, but he had made it clear no one would be silenced. The moments that had begun to chip away at their unity now felt like cracks in the foundation of the entire production. As the day went on, the atmosphere became electric, charged with an inevitable, growing confrontation. It all came to a head when Tom arrived on set a little earlier than usual. His sharp eyes immediately spotted Victor huddled with a few key crew members near the director's monitor. They were speaking in hushed tones, their faces drawn with concern. As Tom walked past, their murmurs stopped, and the stares that followed made it clear that the rumor mill had already been turning. Whispers of the tension between him and Victor had now spread like wildfire, and the crew was beginning to choose sides. Tom's first instinct was to check on Sandra, to make sure she was all right. She was preparing for a scene, her costume and makeup ready, but the nervous energy around her was palpable. She smiled at him when he approached, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You okay?" Tom asked, keeping his voice low. Sandra glanced around before responding. "I don't know. I can feel it, Tom. Everyone's either scared of Victor, or they're mad at you. I don't know how much longer this can go on." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability she had hidden so well. Tom looked around at the set, noticing for the first time how the crew members seemed to avoid making eye contact with him. Some were busy pretending to focus on their tasks, others were standing off to the side, but there was an underlying sense of unease. The cracks were starting to show, and he knew that this film, his film, was on the verge of unraveling. "I won't let him ruin this," Tom said firmly, his tone hardening. "Not for you, not for me, and not for the people who put their heart into this project." Before Sandra could respond, the loud, abrasive sound of Victor's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Where the hell is Cruz?" he barked. "We're wasting daylight here. Get him on set, now." Tom's jaw tightened. He exchanged a look with Sandra, who looked both concerned and resigned. They both knew what was coming, and there was no more time to delay it. As Tom walked toward the set, he steeled himself. He wasn't going to back down, not today. Not when everything was on the line. Victor was standing in front of the camera, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes scanning the monitors with impatience. The crew shuffled awkwardly behind him, as though they were too afraid to make a single move without his approval. Tom approached him, the tension between them thicker than ever. "You wanted me?" Tom's voice was calm but carried an unmistakable weight. Victor barely looked up at him. "Don't make me wait next time, Tom. This is a professional set, not some playground where you can show up whenever you feel like it." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Maybe if you treated people like professionals, we wouldn't be in this situation." A flicker of anger flashed in Victor's eyes. He pushed his chair back sharply, standing up straight to meet Tom's gaze. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You may be the star, but you don't run my set. This is my production, my vision, and if you want to make your little speech, you can do it on your own time. Not here, not now." The tension in the air grew unbearable. Crew members shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at their watches, as if hoping for a way out of the impending confrontation. Sandra stood nearby, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to speak, to step in and calm things down, but this wasn't her fight anymore. This was Tom's battle, and he was fighting for all of them. "Victor," Tom's voice rang out, low and deadly calm, "you've humiliated Sandra on this set far too many times. And if you think I'm going to stand here and let you tear this crew apart because of your ego, you've got another thing coming." Victor's face went from red to purple, his eyes flaring with fury. For a moment, the room was dead silent, the weight of Tom's words hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Victor stepped forward, jabbing a finger in Tom's direction. "You think you can just come in here and tell me how to do my job? You think your pretty boy act will save you from the fallout when I report this to the studio? I'll have you blacklisted from every major production. Try me." Tom didn't flinch. He was calm, controlled. "You want to play that game, Victor? Go ahead. But it won't be me who pays for it." Just as the air seemed to thicken with the promise of something breaking, there was a sudden voice from behind. "Enough." The crew turned in shock, and even Tom and Victor paused. Sandra, her face a mix of determination and frustration, stepped forward. She stood between the two men, facing Victor head-on. "You've made your point," Sandra said, her voice steady but fierce. "But you need to understand something, what you're doing here, how you've treated everyone, is unacceptable. And I won't let you destroy the integrity of this film just because your ego can't take it when someone stands up to you." Victor's face twisted with anger, but there was an undeniable flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He hadn't expected Sandra to speak out, Not like this, not in front of the crew, not with Tom backing her up. Get her out of here, Victor snarled, waving a dismissive hand. She's just an actress. She doesn't know anything about the real work around here. That was the breaking point. Tom stepped forward, his body language conveying his resolve, his voice a quiet but powerful promise. Victor, he said, his words final, if you don't respect Sandra, then you don't respect me. And I'm done letting you walk all over us. The room held its breath, as if waiting for the final blow. The clash between Tom and Victor had come to a head, and now it was clear, only one of them could walk away with the power. The room was dead silent, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on everyone. Tom and Sandra stood side by side, their eyes locked on Victor, who was visibly seething but also unsure of how to respond. The moment had arrived, the final confrontation between power and integrity, and the tension was nearly unbearable. Victor's face contorted in fury, but he couldn't bring himself to act on his anger. The crew had already witnessed too much, Tom's unwavering stance, Sandra's defiance, and the crack in Victor's once imposing facade. He wasn't the invincible director anymore. Not today. You think this is your set, Victor? Tom's voice was low but carried a quiet authority that rang through the tension in the air. You think you can treat people however you want? That ends now. Victor opened his mouth to retort, but for the first time, his words faltered. He looked around the set at the crew, some of whom had begun to stand straighter, others watching with bated breath. They were no longer fearful of his power. The balance had shifted. Don't you dare, Victor began, but Tom cut him off. Don't I dare what? Tom's voice was steady, now tinged with a quiet but undeniable finality. Victor, you've made this personal, but I'm done letting you destroy people for your own twisted sense of control. Sandra, the crew, everyone on this set deserves better than to be treated like dirt under your boots. If that means the studio hears about this, then so be it. Victor's jaw clenched as his fists tightened, but something in his eyes shifted. His usual arrogance started to crumble, revealing a vulnerability that not even he could hide. The reality of losing his power, of being exposed for what he was starting to set in. The air crackled with tension, but Tom's resolve never wavered. He had fought for this moment, fought for the chance to stand up not just for Sandra, but for what was right. His refusal to back down had forced Victor to face the consequences of his actions, consequences that went far beyond the superficial power struggles of the set. Sandra looked over at Tom, her expression softening. She had never expected him to go this far, to fight for her in a way that went beyond the usual camaraderie of co-stars. But here he was, standing by her side, not just as an ally but as someone who believed in the right thing, even when it meant risking his own standing in the industry. His bravery wasn't just a spark, it was a blaze, one that illuminated the path for others to follow. Victor seemed to realize, in that moment, that the fight wasn't just against Tom or Sandra. It was against the very foundation of the power he had so carefully cultivated for years. This was no longer about directing a movie or making demands, it was about the fact that his actions had caught up with him, and the crew had seen enough. The room was still, everyone waiting for Victor's response. But instead of further escalation, something unexpected happened. Victor's shoulders slumped, and he took a deep, shaky breath. The pride that had once defined him seemed to evaporate in an instant. He began, his voice almost a whisper. I've been wrong. The words hung in the air, almost unbelievable. For the first time, Victor wasn't the domineering force everyone had feared. He was, in that moment, a man who understood the weight of his actions. It was a rare, humanizing moment for a man who had built his career on dominance, but one that had the power to change everything. Sandra's eyes widened, and she glanced at Tom, who gave her a small nod. They weren't expecting an apology, but this moment, this acknowledgement, was the first step toward resolution. Victor's gaze fell, and he looked up at Tom and Sandra, his voice steadier now. I'll do better. For all of us. The air seemed to shift. What had been a powder keg ready to explode was now a moment of tentative peace. The power struggle had shifted from one of ego and control to one of accountability and recognition. But even as the tension began to ease, there was still one more thing to be addressed. Tom turned to the crew, his gaze sweeping across them. This is a set for all of us. Not just for him, not just for me, but for everyone here. We deserve respect. And we will have it. The crew exchanged glances, and for the first time in days, a sense of unity seemed to settle over them. The director had been humbled, but the battle wasn't over yet. There was still work to do, still trust to rebuild and respect to earn. But the biggest shift had already happened. Victor had been forced to reckon with his own behavior, and Tom had made sure that no one on set would ever have to endure his cruelty again. As the tension began to lift, Sandra felt a weight on her chest that she hadn't realized was there. She had been fighting for herself, yes, but in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just her fight. It was theirs. Together, they had stood up against someone who had tried to break them, and together, they had won. The days that followed the confrontation on set were filled with a strange, almost surreal calm. It was as if the storm that had been brewing for so long had finally passed, leaving a stillness in its wake, one that was both comforting and uncertain. Tom and Sandra stood side by side, each feeling the aftershocks of the battle they had just fought, but neither of them knew how much the tides had truly shifted until they saw it reflected in the faces of the crew. Victor, though visibly humbled, wasn't out of the picture yet. He still had a role to play in the film, but the power he once wielded with such arrogance had been stripped away. Instead of walking around the set like a tyrant, barking orders and belittling everyone in his path, he had become almost unrecognizable. He was quieter, more deliberate in his actions. At first, the crew wasn't sure if they could trust this new, softer Victor, but with each passing day, he proved his sincerity. He began showing respect, not just to Tom or Sandra, but to everyone who worked behind the scenes, from the lighting crew to the sound technicians. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but with each small gesture, each apology, each act of kindness, he began to rebuild what he had nearly destroyed. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was enough for the project to move forward with a renewed sense of unity. As for Sandra, there was a sense of peace that slowly replaced the tension she had carried for so long. It wasn't just about surviving the set anymore, it was about thriving, about finding the strength to fight for what was right. She had always been known as the talented, graceful actress, but this experience had shown her something new about herself. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she was a force in her own right. And while the path hadn't been easy, she had learned how to stand tall in the face of adversity. She took a moment to reflect on all that had happened. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, but in the end, she had come out stronger. She had expected the worst from Victor, but Tom had been there to remind her of her worth. It wasn't just about surviving a toxic environment, it was about confronting it head-on and demanding more for yourself. And she had done that. Sandra's gaze fell on Tom, who was standing a few feet away, talking to one of the crew members. He had been her anchor throughout the entire ordeal. When she had doubted herself, when she had felt like there was no way out, he had reminded her that there was always a way forward. It wasn't just his words, though, it was his actions. Tom didn't just fight for her in the big moments, he fought for her every day, in the smallest of ways. Whether it was checking in on her between takes, standing up for her when no one else would, or simply offering a word of encouragement when she needed it most, he had proven what it meant to be a true ally. Their friendship had deepened through this ordeal. What had started as a professional relationship, one built on mutual respect for each other's craft, had evolved into something much more meaningful. Tom had seen Sandra for who she truly was, a woman of integrity, strength, and grace. And Sandra had come to understand Tom as more than just a movie star. He was a man who believed in doing the right thing, even when it meant going against the tide. He didn't need the validation of others to do what was just. It was this quiet strength that made him more than just an actor, it made him a leader, both on and off the screen. Victor had been forced to come to terms with his actions, and while it wasn't the cleanest process, it was a necessary one. The real victory wasn't in Tom's bold stand or Sandra's quiet strength, it was in the transformation of the set itself. The crew, once fractured by fear and distrust, had found solidarity in the aftermath of the confrontation. They began to work together with a renewed sense of purpose, their collective energy shifting towards something greater than the project itself. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of filming, Sandra and Tom found themselves alone in the quiet of the set. The last of the crew members had packed up for the day, and the hum of the equipment had died down. It was just the two of them now, standing in the middle of the soundstage, surrounded by the remnants of a long day's work. Sandra broke the silence first, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Tom. I don't think I would have made it through without you." Tom turned to her, offering a small, knowing smile. "You'd have made it through just fine, Sandra. You're stronger than you know. You just needed someone to remind you of that." Sandra shook her head, her eyes meeting his. "No, Tom. You showed me what real strength looks like. You didn't just stand up for me, you showed everyone that there's more to this business than just the power plays and the egos. You proved that we all deserve respect, no matter what our place is on the set." Tom's smile deepened. "That's what makes you different, Sandra. You never needed anyone to tell you that you're worthy. You've always known your value. I just helped you see it again." There was a long pause between them, the weight of the past few weeks settling over them. It wasn't just about surviving this chaotic film, it was about something deeper. It was about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. And that was something they both had learned in their own ways. As they walked off the set together, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the stage. It felt like the beginning of something new, something stronger. The film was still underway, and there were challenges ahead, but for the first time in weeks, there was hope that the work they were doing would be something more than just a project. It would be a testament to the resilience of the people behind it. The story of their time on set would live on in the final product, a product that would be remembered not just for its cinematic value, but for the journey it had taken to make it. A journey that had, in the end, changed all of them for the better. As the final days of shooting approached, the tension that had once gripped the set seemed like a distant memory. The atmosphere was lighter now, filled with laughter and camaraderie. It wasn't just the absence of fear that made it different, it was the presence of mutual respect. Tom, Sandra, and even Victor had learned something important in the weeks that had passed. The set was no longer a battlefield, it was a place for collaboration and creativity. Victor, now fully aware of the consequences of his previous actions, had transformed. His relationship with the crew had shifted. He started showing up early to greet everyone, asking how they were doing and acknowledging their hard work. His actions weren't perfect, but they were genuine. No longer did he act like the god of the set, but instead as a part of the collective effort. His ego had taken a hit, but in its place, something far more valuable emerged: humility. Tom and Sandra had, in their own way, become the backbone of this transformation. While they never sought praise for their roles, the entire crew knew that without their intervention, nothing would have changed. Tom's unwavering stance against Victor had inspired others to speak up, and Sandra's quiet strength had proven that one person could make a difference, sometimes, just by being steadfast in their beliefs. One evening, as the last scene of the film was being wrapped up, Sandra found herself standing next to Tom, gazing at the set as the final take was called. It was a bittersweet moment, everything had come full circle, but the journey had been long and hard. "I think we did it," Sandra said quietly, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and a quiet pride. Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, we did. But it wasn't just us. It was everyone. This whole set came together." Sandra smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. They had fought the good fight, and it wasn't just about standing up to one person. It had been about changing the culture, one small act of courage at a time. And as she stood there, surrounded by the crew, people who had once been afraid to speak up but now stood with pride, she knew they had created something lasting. The film, once a symbol of tension and discord, had become a testament to what could happen when people refused to tolerate injustice. It would not just be remembered for its artistic merits but for the quiet revolution that had taken place behind the scenes. A revolution of integrity, humility, and courage. As the credits rolled on the set, Sandra turned to Tom, offering him a sincere smile. "Thank you for everything." Tom met her gaze, his smile as warm as ever. "You don't have to thank me, Sandra. You were part of this from the very beginning. We all were." And just like that, the story came to a close, one of personal growth, redemption, and the understanding that even the smallest acts of bravery can inspire change. It was a reminder that in the face of arrogance, humility is the most powerful force. And that sometimes, the people we least expect to stand up for us are the ones who end up changing everything.